When the first German prisoners of war captured in North Africa in 1943 sat down to their initial meal in American custody, they stared at plates piled with portions so large they assumed it was food meant for an entire week. But when guards told them this was just one meal and there would be more tomorrow, many prisoners broke down crying because they realized everything the Nazi regime had told them about American weakness and poverty had been a calculated lie. Over 375,000 German military personnel would spend time in American POW camps between 1943 and 1946. Scattered across hundreds of facilities from Florida to Washington state, and the shock of that first American meal became a recurring theme in prisoner accounts, letters, and post-war interviews that revealed how food became the most powerful propaganda tool the United States never intended to create. The story begins not in America but in the deserts of Tunisia, where German soldiers of the Afrika Korps, already weakened by supply shortages and the grinding retreat after El Alamein, surrendered to American forces, expecting the harsh treatment that Nazi propaganda had promised awaited anyone who fell into enemy hands. The rations that German soldiers had been receiving in North Africa by early 1943 were already significantly reduced from what they'd enjoyed during the early years of the war, when German logistics could still supply forward units adequately. Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had been operating at the end of impossibly long supply lines that stretched across the Mediterranean, lines that were increasingly disrupted by Allied naval and air power that sank transport ships and destroyed supply convoys. German soldiers were receiving perhaps 2,000 calories per day when they were lucky, often less, with meals consisting of hard black bread, thin soup, occasional tinned meat, and ersatz coffee that tasted like burned grain because that's essentially what it was. These men were hungry in a sustained, grinding way that sapped energy and morale. Hungry enough that food dominated their thoughts and conversations. When they surrendered to American forces and were processed as prisoners, many expected conditions to worsen because Nazi propaganda had spent years describing Americans as soft, weak, and barely capable of feeding their own depression-ravaged population, let alone prisoners of war. The first meals served to German POWs after capture varied depending on where and when they were taken prisoner, but the pattern was remarkably consistent. Americans gave prisoners the same rations that American soldiers received, a decision based on both Geneva Convention requirements and American logistical abundance that meant feeding prisoners, same as troops, was actually simpler than creating separate reduced ration systems. For prisoners captured in North Africa and processed through facilities in Algeria before being shipped to the United States, that first meal often came within hours of surrender. Lieutenant Hans Werner, whose memoir was published in Germany in 1957, described being given a tray at a processing camp near Iran that contained white bread, canned meat, cheese, fruit, cocktail, coffee with real sugar, and chocolate. Werner initially thought this was a special interrogation technique, that Americans were fattening him up before harsh questioning. But when guards simply collected the empty trays and told prisoners to rest, he began to realize that perhaps this was standard treatment. The quantities were what shocked prisoners most profoundly. American military rations in 1943 provided approximately 4,000 calories per day for soldiers in active service. Portions designed for men doing physically demanding work in various climates. When these same rations were given to prisoners who'd been subsisting on reduced German rations, the effect was overwhelming. Prisoners reported feeling almost sick from eating so much food after months of privation, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle the sudden abundance. Medical officers at POW processing facilities documented that many prisoners experienced digestive distress in their first days of American captivity, simply because their bodies needed time to adjust to adequate nutrition. Sergeant Otto Fischer, whose diary was preserved in the National Archives, wrote that after his first American meal, he felt so full he could barely move, describing the sensation as simultaneously wonderful and slightly frightening because he'd forgotten what it felt like to eat until satisfied rather than eating until the food ran out. While hunger remained, the variety of American rations astounded prisoners, who'd grown accustomed to German military food that was monotonous even when adequate. American meals included fresh vegetables when available, multiple types of meat, bread that was soft and white rather than the dense dark bread Germans knew, dairy products, including real butter and cheese, and desserts that seemed like luxuries inappropriate for wartime. Fruit became particularly significant in prisoner accounts because many German soldiers hadn't seen fresh fruit in months or years. Citrus especially being a rarity in wartime Germany, where naval blockades and priorities for the military meant civilian populations went without. When prisoners received oranges or grapefruit with their meals, some saved them for days. Almost unable to believe they were allowed to eat such delicacies, one prisoner in a camp in Texas wrote to his family in 1944 describing an orange he'd been given, spending an entire paragraph detailing the experience of peeling it and tasting citrus for the first time in 3 years, writing that he'd eaten it slowly to make the experience last as long as possible. The coffee represented another cultural shock because American coffee, while not particularly sophisticated by modern standards, was real coffee made from actual coffee beans rather than the ersatz substitutes that had become standard in German military rations. Prisoners who'd been drinking roasted grain or chicory drinks that were called coffee but bore little resemblance to the real thing found themselves drinking cup after cup of actual coffee, marveling at the taste and the fact that sugar was available to sweeten it. Sugar itself had become a luxury in wartime Germany, where rationing meant civilians received tiny allocations and military rations included limited amounts. American camps provided sugar freely at meals, along with real cream or condensed milk, creating coffee that prisoners described in letters home with almost religious reverence. The bread deserves particular attention because it became symbolic of broader differences between American and German societies that prisoners were forced to confront. German bread was traditionally dense, dark, and made from rye or mixed grains. Bread that was filling and nutritious but heavy and somewhat coarse. American white bread, made from refined wheat flour and baked to a soft consistency, seemed almost cake-like to German prisoners encountering it for the first time. Some prisoners initially disliked it, considering it inferior to proper German bread. But over time, many came to appreciate its lightness. More significantly, sheer quantity of bread available shocked prisoners who'd come from a society where bread rationing was strict and every slice was precious. American camps served bread at every meal with no limits on consumption. Prisoners could have second and third helpings, and bread that went uneaten was simply thrown away. A waste that horrified Germans raised in a culture of careful resource management, but that also demonstrated American abundance in ways no propaganda could match. The meat portions provided another daily reminder of American productive capacity. German military rations had included meat, but often in processed forms like sausage or tinned goods, and in quantities that were adequate but not generous. American rations included substantial portions of beef, pork, or chicken, often fresh rather than preserved, cooked in various styles that introduced German prisoners to American culinary traditions. Fried chicken became particularly memorable for many prisoners who'd never encountered this distinctly American dish. A prisoner named Karl Heinz, whose interview was recorded for a historical project at the University of Minnesota in the 1980s, described his first experience with fried chicken at a camp in Mississippi, explaining that he'd expected chicken to be boiled or roasted as it would be in Germany, but found the crispy fried coating and juicy meat to be a revelation. The fact that prisoners received entire pieces of chicken rather than small portions stretched into stews or soups demonstrated a level of food abundance that contradicted everything they'd been told about American economic weakness. The deserts pushed many prisoners into cognitive dissonance because sweets had become rare. Luxuries in wartime Germany, where sugar was tightly rationed and ingredients for the processing facilities where prisoners first entered American custody and received their initial meals were designed for efficiency rather than comfort. But even these temporary facilities provided food that exceeded what many prisoners had eaten in months. At Camp Philip Morris in North Africa, a processing facility named ironically after the cigarette brand, prisoners passing through on their way to ships that would take them to America received meals that set the pattern for what they'd experience in permanent camps. Facility staff documented that many prisoners asked if they could save food from meals, trying to hoard bread or other items against future scarcity, a behavior that reflected the privation mentality they'd developed. Guards had to explain repeatedly that saving food was unnecessary, that the next meal would be equally abundant. A message that took days or weeks for prisoners to truly accept. The ships that transported prisoners from North Africa to America provided another experience of American food abundance. Troop transport ships normally carried American soldiers across the Atlantic, and when they returned carrying German POWs, the prisoners received the same rations that American troops had eaten on the westbound journey. Aboard the USS Henry Gibbons in June 1943, German prisoners recorded in letters and diaries that they received 3 full meals per day during the Atlantic crossing. Food that was better than what they'd eaten as free soldiers in the Afrika Korps. The irony was not lost on these men that capture had improved their material conditions. A realization that began the psychological process of questioning what they'd been told about the war, their enemies, and their own government's competence. Upon arrival at American ports, prisoners were transported to camps that were distributed strategically across the country, with large concentrations in the South and Southwest where climate was suitable and labor needs in agriculture were desperate due to American workers joining the military or moving to better-paying war industry jobs. The camps themselves varied in quality and amenities, but the food remained consistently abundant across all facilities because American military logistics treated feeding prisoners as just another supply problem to be solved with the same industrial efficiency that characterized the American war effort. Camp kitchens were staffed by both American personnel and prisoners who were assigned to food service, with German cooks often expressing amazement at the quantities of ingredients available to them. A prisoner named Wilhelm, who worked in the kitchen at a camp in Kansas, wrote to his brother in Germany in 1944, describing walking into a storeroom filled with sacks of flour, sugar, rice, coffee, and canned goods stacked floor to ceiling. More food in one room than he'd seen in the last 2 years of military service. The quality of meat available in American camps exceeded what most German civilians were receiving back home by 1943. A fact that became clear to prisoners as they received letters from families describing increasing hardship. While prisoners ate beefsteak or pork chops in Texas or Georgia, their families in Hamburg or Berlin were receiving tiny meat rations, supplemented by whatever could be found on black markets or grown in small gardens. This inversion of normal expectations, where prisoners ate better than free civilians in their home country, created psychological distress for many prisoners who felt guilty about their relative comfort while loved ones suffered. Some prisoners asked if they could send food home, requests that were denied because international mail couldn't accommodate perishable goods and because sending American food to Germany would violate various wartime regulations. But the impulse revealed the emotional complexity of captivity under conditions of abundance. The camp canteens, where prisoners could purchase additional food and goods using wages earned from work programs, provided another layer of abundance that seemed incomprehensible. 2 men from rationed societies, prisoners who worked on farms, in factories, or on various labor projects, earned wages paid in scrip that could be spent at camp. Canteens stocked with items ranging from toiletries to snacks to tobacco products, the candy bars, soft drinks, potato chips, and other snack foods available in these canteens were products many prisoners had never encountered. American commercial food products that didn't exist in German food culture. A prisoner named Ernst described in a post-war interview his first encounter with a Coca-Cola, purchased from a camp canteen in Louisiana, explaining that he'd been skeptical of the dark fizzy liquid but found the sweet carbonated drink refreshing in the southern heat and completely unlike anything available in Germany.